Try to imagine this: there is a truth right in front of you, and yet you have never truly recognized it. A truth powerful enough to change the entire way you see human history. A truth that, if you understood it all the way to the end, you would never again be able to live, think, or see this world the way you do now. You may think humanity once passed through ages of darkness, times when people did not know where they came from, did not know where they were going, and had no one to guide them. You may think there were distant lands, isolated tribes, ancient civilizations that lived and died without ever receiving a single warning from the Creator. But what if all of that is wrong? What if there has never been a single moment in history when humanity was truly abandoned? What if the reality is that everywhere you can imagine, in every age, among every people, someone always stood up carrying a message that today you almost never hear anymore? Stop for a moment and face this number: 124,000. That is not some vague estimate. It is a number passed down through trusted sources in Islamic tradition. 124,000 prophets once walked this earth. Not a few dozen, not a few hundred. 124,000. If that number is true, then what does it mean? It means this world has never operated in silence. It means history is not just a chain of random human mistakes. It means behind every civilization, every culture, every belief, there was once a moment when the truth was spoken clearly. Picture this: a man standing among his own people. No power, no army, no wealth, yet he carries a message he believes matters more than his own life. He tells them, you were not created by accident. You will not vanish without meaning. There is one Creator watching everything you do, and one day, all of you will answer. Just imagine what that feels like. You are the only person in your whole community who believes that. You say it out loud, but everyone around you looks at you like you have lost your mind. They mock you. They deny you. They turn away. But you keep going, because you know if you stay silent, they lose their one chance to understand the truth. And then imagine that scene happening not just once, not 10 times, but tens of thousands of times all across this planet. In deep forests never recorded in any book. On islands that modern maps only discovered recently. Across vast deserts where footprints vanish after a single gust of wind. In ancient cities that today are nothing but ruins. In all of those places someone once stood up. A warning was once spoken. An opportunity once existed. But the most chilling part is not that there were so many prophets. It is that most of them have disappeared from human memory. You do not know their names. You have never heard their stories. You do not know how they lived, how they were rejected, what they sacrificed. But that does not mean they never existed. It only means you are living in a world where most of the truth has been buried under the dust of time. Prophetic history explained. If you are still listening at this point, you are not here by accident. You are beginning to touch a completely different way of looking at history. A perspective in which no nation was overlooked. No community was forgotten. No generation ever truly lived without being reminded. There was always someone. There was always a voice. There was always a warning before everything came to an end. And that leads to a question very few people are willing to face. If all those people before us were once warned, then what happened to them? What made them abandon the message they once heard? What made civilizations that were once guided fall into beliefs that today we call false? And more importantly, if the world was never abandoned in the past, are you sure you are being abandoned in the present? Or are you standing in that very same story? A story where the truth is always there, but not everyone recognizes it. If you want to explore this entire picture, if you want to understand what really happened to the tens of thousands of messengers who once passed through this world, subscribe right now and support Prophetic History Explained, so we can keep bringing you stories that very few people are willing to tell. If you accept that this world has never been abandoned, then a question naturally appears, and it is not an easy one to answer. Why did there have to be so many? Why were just a few people, a few moments, a few messages not enough? Why did it take tens of thousands of messengers repeating the same call over thousands of years across every land? The answer is not about excess. It is rooted in something much deeper, a principle that, once you understand it, will completely change the way you think about justice. At the foundation of faith, there is one rule that never changes. No judgment comes before a clear warning. That means no one is condemned for something they never had the chance to understand. No one is held accountable for a truth they never heard. And if that is true, then one unavoidable conclusion follows. Wherever human beings exist, there must be a reminder. In every age where a community exists, someone must be sent to them. No exceptions, no empty spaces, no silent zones in history like so many people assume. Imagine being born into a tribe completely cut off from the outside world. You have never heard of any religion. You do not know the idea of one creator. You live by what your ancestors passed down, following rituals you have never even thought to question. If one day you were judged, would that be fair? If you had never heard, never reminded, never been warned, would you truly be guilty? The answer faith gives is no. And that is exactly why the story cannot stop at whether prophets existed or not. It becomes a complete system, a system in which guidance always comes before judgment, a system in which light is always sent before darkness is condemned. This is not just a religious idea, it is a tightly consistent logic. If Allah is absolutely just, then he would never punish a people who were never warned. And if humanity has existed all across the earth, from dry deserts to dense forests, from isolated islands to remote mountain regions where no one else ever reached, then that leads to an unavoidable conclusion. Every one of those places once had someone carrying the message. That changes the way you see the world completely, because it destroys a very common illusion, the idea that some people were forgotten. No one was forgotten. No child in history was born into a fate already sealed without ever having the chance to know. No nation was condemned simply because it was born in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is not how justice works. But what makes this truth feel so heavy is not that everyone once had a chance. It is that not everyone took it. Imagine the moment when someone stands up in the middle of his community and says something completely against everything people believe. He carries no weapon, no power, no personal benefit, only a warning that there is only one creator. That one day everyone will answer that what people believe may not be the truth. What do you think happens next? History has repeated the answer thousands of times: denial, mockery, resistance, and sometimes violence. But the important thing is not how people reacted. The important thing is that the warning was delivered. The door was opened, the light appeared, and from that moment on, responsibility began. This is the point many people do not want to face. They prefer to believe that people just did not know, that they were only victims of circumstance, that they had no choice. But if the truth is they did have a choice, then everything changes. Responsibility is no longer some abstract idea. It becomes something deeply personal, direct, and very hard to escape. When you look back at history through that lens, you will stop seeing civilizations as nothing more than stories of growth and collapse. You will begin to see the moments when truth was delivered, the points where light met rejection, the times when people were given an opportunity and their choices shaped their future. And then another unavoidable question begins to rise. If this principle has always existed, if warning always comes before judgment, if no one was forgotten in the past, then where do you stand within that law? Do you really lack information? Or have you been reminded more than you realize? And if the answer is the second one, then what does that mean for you? Because the moment you realize you have been warned, the story is no longer about history. It becomes your story. If you only look at the surface of history, you will see differences everywhere, different cultures, opposing belief systems, rituals that even we sometimes cannot make sense of. Some people worship the sun, some worship fire, some bow before stone idols, and others believe in unseen forces they cannot explain. Looking at all of that, it is easy to conclude that humanity created completely different religions with no common ground and no real connection. But if you dig one layer deeper, you start to notice something strange. Behind all those different forms, the same traces keep appearing in ways that are almost impossible to ignore. The idea of a supreme being, the belief that this life is not the end, the sense that human actions carry consequences beyond what we can see, the emphasis on morality, on justice, on treating others the right way. These things do not just appear in one place or at one moment in time. They appear everywhere, in civilizations that never came into contact with one another, in tribes that lived apart for thousands of years, in societies that, geographically speaking, had no way to share knowledge. Why is that? Why would people with no connection to one another still share the same core ideas? The answer is not coincidence. The answer is origin. If all of those communities once received the same message, but delivered in a way that fit their circumstances, then everything starts to make sense. It is not that there are many different truths. It is that there is one truth expressed through countless forms. Imagine someone sent to a community living in the desert. Their lives revolve around water, wind, and the harshness of nature. If he speaks about the signs of the Creator, what would he talk about? He would talk about rain arriving at the right time, about winds that carry life, about the vast sky they see every single day. Now imagine someone else sent to a community by the sea. Their lives are tied to waves, tides, and voyages with no certainty of return. His message would be filled with the imagery of the ocean, of storms, of a power human beings cannot control. The same truth, but expressed in a completely different way. Not because the truth changed, but because people need to be reached in ways they can understand. This is what many people miss. They see the differences and think that is proof of contradiction. But in reality, it is proof of adaptation. A message cannot be delivered in exactly the same way to every people. A shepherd and a king cannot be spoken to in the same way. A hunting tribe and a society with a complex legal system cannot receive guidance in the exact same form. But what never changes is the core of the message. Only one being is worthy of worship. This life is not the end, and every action will be accounted for. That explains a paradox people often fail to understand. Why can religions differ in ritual but still resemble one another in morality? Why can laws change while the principles of right and wrong remain almost the same? Because laws can fit a specific age. But truth does not change. You may change the way you live, but you cannot change the truth that you will be held accountable for that life. Once you start seeing things this way, history no longer looks like a mess of opposing religions. It becomes a unified picture. A picture in which every civilization is part of the same story. A story repeated again and again with different details, but the same core. And then another question begins to rise. If the message was always the same, if the truth never changed, if only the form of expression was different, then why do we see so many differences today that seem almost impossible to reconcile? What happened after the message was delivered? What made what was once clear become blurred? What turned one simple truth into thousands of complex systems of belief? The answer lies in something history has repeated more than almost anything else. Not in the original differences, but in what human beings did afterward. No message disappears overnight. No truth is corrupted in a single evening. It all happens slowly, almost invisibly, until one day, looking back, people realize they have moved very far from where they started. When a prophet leaves, what remains is not the miracles, not the extraordinary moments, but his words, his way of life, and the people who believed in him. At that moment, the message is still intact. His followers understand clearly what they were taught. They hold on to it as something sacred. But the problem does not begin with that generation. It begins with the generations after them. The people who never met the prophet. The people who only heard the story from others. The people living in different circumstances, with different pressures, different minds, different concerns. At first, the change is very small. A phrase gets adjusted to make it easier to understand. A local custom is kept because it does not seem like a big deal. A detail is added to make the teaching seem clearer. No one thinks they are doing anything wrong. They believe they are helping the message survive. But those tiny changes are exactly where things begin to drift. Over time, what was once an exception becomes a habit. What was once an explanation becomes a rule. What was once an addition becomes something inseparable. And then one day, people look at their own system of belief and can no longer tell what was there in the beginning. That is how distortion happens, not through direct destruction, but through accumulation, a little at a time, one layer at a time, until the truth is covered by everything added around it. But that is not the only cause. There is another force stronger and more dangerous: power. When a message begins to influence many people, it is no longer just a private belief. It becomes a force within society. And anything with influence will attract people who want to control it. Those in power realize that if they can shape belief, they can shape people. If they can change how people understand right and wrong, they can control the behavior of an entire community. And from that point on, the message starts to be adjusted no longer for truth, but for advantage. The difficult parts get softened. The convenient parts get emphasized. The challenging parts get removed, and little by little a new system begins to form. A system that looks real but is no longer real. At the same time, another force is quietly at work. Habit. Human beings do not believe only what they understand. They believe what feels familiar. If a generation is born and raised inside a system of belief that has already been altered, they will not see it as false. To them, it is the truth. It is how the world works. It is what their parents believed, what their grandparents believed, what their entire community believed. And once a belief becomes tradition, it becomes very difficult to question. Not because it is true, but because it is familiar. That is why when a new prophet appears, he usually does not face only intellectual resistance. He faces an entire system that has been reinforced over generations. He is not just speaking to individuals. He is challenging a whole structure, a structure people have grown attached to, built up, and defended. And because of that, rejection does not come only from disbelief. It comes from fear. Fear of losing what feels familiar. Fear of change. Fear of admitting they were wrong. But the most tragic part is not that people changed the message. It is that they still believed they were preserving it. They prayed, they practiced, they defended their faith, but they did not realize that what they were defending no longer looked like the original message. That is the greatest tragedy. Not that truth disappeared, but that it was replaced and no one noticed. And when you look back at history, from that angle you begin to see a pattern repeating itself. A message appears, a community is guided, time passes, and then the drift begins. Not because the message is weak, but because human beings fail to preserve it. That is also why the differences between religious systems today do not come from different beginnings. They come from the different paths those systems took after that beginning. One path stayed closer to the source. One path turned another direction. One path split into many branches, but all of them began at one point. And once you understand that, you begin to see religions, cultures, and belief systems not as completely separate things, but as altered versions of something that was once very clear. But if that is how things have unfolded all throughout history, if the message is always changed over time, if human beings always tend to distort what they are taught, then one unavoidable question appears. What guarantees that this time will be different? What guarantees that the final message will not follow the same path? And if there is an answer to that, then that is exactly where this story enters its most important stage. There will come a moment when all of human history will no longer look like separate stories. A moment when every age, every civilization, every community is placed side by side in one single picture. No more past or present. No more distance between generations. No more separation between faraway lands. Everything comes together in one day. A day no one can escape. A day when no explanation can hide the truth anymore. Just imagine you are standing in a vast space beyond anything you can picture. No limits, no end. And all around you are not the people you know, not the faces of the present, but all of humanity, from the first human being who appeared to the last one who will ever live on this earth. But what makes that scene overwhelming is not just the number of people. It is the people standing in front, the people you never met, the people whose names were never written in any book, the people history forgot but truth never forgot. 124,000 prophets, one by one standing there, no longer alone, no longer mocked, no longer rejected, all of them standing in their place as witnesses, each one representing a community, each one carrying one question for the people who once heard them. What did you do with what you were told? That is no longer a general question. It is a personal one, direct, impossible to avoid, impossible to hand off to someone else, impossible to say you did not know if you once did know. And that is when another truth becomes clear. Justice is not an abstract concept. It is a reality that will be carried out. No one is judged based on what they never had the chance to receive. But no one is exempt either if they were reminded and still turned away. You will not be asked about what happened in a place you never went. You will not be asked about what you never heard, but you will have to face what came to you. The moments when you were reminded, the times you felt the truth but chose to ignore it, the moments when you understood but did not act. This is the point where the story is no longer about them, no longer about civilizations that vanished, no longer about communities that once existed. It becomes about you. Because if you are hearing these words, If you are understanding each layer of meaning being opened up, then you are no longer standing outside the story. You are inside it. You are standing in the same current where millions before you once stood. They also had an opportunity. They were also reminded, and they also had to choose. Some listened, some turned away. And the outcome of that choice was not something they could change later. What makes that moment so heavy is not punishment. It is clarity. No more confusion, no more gray areas, no more self-deception. Everything becomes obvious in a way human beings will not be able to deny. And in that moment, something many people do not want to admit will be exposed. The problem was never a lack of evidence. The problem was never a lack of opportunity. The problem was always choice. And that leads to a responsibility you cannot escape. You are not a prophet. You were not sent with a mission like theirs. But you are not completely separate from the road they walked. Because every time you know something is true and choose to live by it, you carry forward a part of that mission. Every time you understand a truth and do not hide it, you preserve part of the legacy they carried. And on the other hand, every time you know but do not act, you repeat exactly what so many before you already did. That is why this story does not end with history. It does not stop with numbers. It does not close with images of the day of judgment. It opens into a question no one else can answer for you. What will you do with what you now know? Because in the end you will not stand there alone. You will stand among a vast crowd, and in front of you will be the ones who once spoke the truth. And in that moment the only thing left will not be what you heard, it will be what you chose. When you look back at the whole story, from the traces buried in history, to the principle of absolute justice, to the unity hidden behind all the differences, then to the tragedy of distortion, and finally to the moment when every truth is laid bare, you begin to realize something you may never have truly faced before. Humanity has never lacked light. It has never lacked guidance. It has never lacked opportunity. The only thing that has always been missing is the right human choice when faced with the truth. Tens of thousands of prophets once walked this earth not to create some mysterious legend. They did not come to become distant figures in memory. They came to remind humanity of something very simple, and also something people forget most easily. You do not exist by accident, and this life is not the end. But over time people did not lose the message. They blurred it. They changed it. They made it so complicated that even they could no longer recognize its original nature. And then they began to live as though they had never been reminded at all. That is the cycle that has repeated throughout history. And if you really think about it more deeply, you will realize that cycle does not belong only to the past. It is happening right now in the present. The greatest lesson is not simply knowing that there were 124,000 prophets. It is understanding that you are standing in the same place where so many before you once stood. You also have information. You also have an opportunity. You also are being reminded. And just like them, you also have to choose. The way to apply this to your life is not by doing something huge right away. It begins with very small things, but very real ones. It begins when you stop and ask yourself, what do I know is right, but I am still delaying? It begins when you look back at your habits and recognize what is pulling you away from the truth you already understand. It begins when you start living with more awareness, not because of pressure from outside, but because you understand that every action carries meaning. And most importantly, it begins when you stop treating reminders as something you just listen to and move on from, and start treating them as something you must respond to. Because in the end, no one is judged by what they heard. They are judged by what they did after hearing it. If you want to keep exploring deeper perspectives on the history of the prophets, the stories that very few people truly understand correctly, and the ways those lessons can change your life today, join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can continue digging into truths that have existed throughout all of human history. And do not forget to subscribe and support Prophetic History Explained so we can keep bringing you content that is deeper, stronger, and maybe powerful enough to completely change the way you see this world.